Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this panel that we've decided that we're just going to make it more of a conversation. And after we kind of like pass the conch between the five of us, we're just going to open it up to the audience to also engage us and maybe even grill us on what we as media practitioners might be missing in terms of health. By the way, my name is Bonto Pilani. I'm a health reporter at Health E News Service. And as we go along, I'll introduce my panelists who are joining me for the session. And Beth gave us basically a very broad topic. She said discuss the biggest health stories from the past year, you know. And as we discussed what this looks like, we kind of thought, let's not just discuss the big topics, but let's talk about really important stuff and critically analyze and reflect and do a little bit of navel gazing in public to hold ourselves accountable and obviously to improve our craft. So I want to start by opening the panel discussion with a quote from one of my favorite authors, Arundhati Roy. And she says that there's no such thing as the voiceless. They are only the deliberately silenced or preferably unheard. And since I decided to take my journey into journalism, this has been a quote that I have quoted for myself and have tried to like live through, you know. There is no such thing as the voiceless. You know, they're the people that we choose to ignore as the media or as individuals, depending on where we are in the privilege of society. But what does this mean when we talk about health journalism? Who are the deliberately silenced voices in our society? Is it the 144 lives that were lost in Life Esidimeni? Or the 17 mental health patients that are still missing and have not been found when Life Esidimeni was happening? Today we will discuss the life and death issues, you know, the lives that are lost, the lives that are broken, never restored, and also how politics, protest, and our skills as journalists or media practitioners falls into place. I have the pleasure of being joined by Sibongile Nkosi, the newly appointed CEO of Health E News Service, Dylan Bush, my former colleague and the senior multimedia journalist at Beksisa Center for Health Journalism, and Vuyo Mkhize, from a health writer from City Press newspaper, and of course Mark Hayward, former executive director of Section 27. And I just want to open this up, guys, by us talking about what is health journalism, what is the state of health journalism currently in the country. You know, we come from an era where 20 years ago, when journalists were reporting about HIV, it was more of from a political standpoint instead of a public health issue. It was civil society like TAC and Section 27 that kind of made it a public health issue. But when we look at the stories that were making it into the newspapers or the headlines or the 11 o'clock news, it was really about a scandal about a politician who had died or likely had died from HIV-related stuff. But now we're at a point where reading about HIV, TB, or even any kind of STIs is a norm in our media space. Where do you think we are as an institution, and what can we do better? Who would like to start for you? I think I'm gonna put you on the spot. For obvious reasons, Beksisa and Health E are NGOs, donor-funded health organizations, and I think that is a topic for another time, but we will also get into it here. And I think for you, you work in a mainstream newspaper, right? What are your experiences as somebody who's passionate about health, wants to write health stories? How do you experience that in a mainstream newspaper like like City Press?
Okay. No, it's not. Okay, so this is my first time speaking at a panel, so I'm quite nervous and excited. Please do not judge me too harshly for reading from what I've prepared. So I started my journalism career 10 years ago. I started off at the Star newspaper. And at that time, I started off as a general reporter, reporting on anything from service delivery protests to marches to court cases, education stories or health stories, basically anything my news editors threw my way. So at this point, I'd like to also draw a comparison or a significant difference in our newsrooms then and now. I was fortunate in a sense that I made it in a time where there was such a thing as a beat journalist. And as the slant of my reporting grew closer and closer towards health, or health stories, I was officially made health reporter at the Star in 2013. At that point, I'll also like to mention that we had like 33 news reporters at the Star. Wow. 33. That is amazing. It was a miracle indeed, and we didn't realize how lucky we had it at that point. And by the time I left the Star, there was 11. And City Press is not much better. It's much better in a lot of other respects, but we are still very much a skeleton newsroom. There's only 4 of us news reporters, and those are the beat specialists. That's myself as a health writer, the education reporter, the entertainment, and then the one reporter who does pretty much general reporting, but it's a beat. And then we have obviously your politics and your sport desks.
Out of curiosity, how many people are on the politics desk?
3.
Okay.
So it's not a lot there. So, you know, this gradual and steady shrinkage of the newsroom, which was as a result of a multitude of factors, chief among which was in line with what was happening in the industry already, you know, with a lot of institutions or media houses migrating into the digital space. And in terms of independent newspapers, there was just an in-house sort of restructuring, which saw a lot of journalists either retrenched or deciding to leave the industry as a whole. So that obviously had a very serious knock-on effect in terms of the newsroom and where we placed our resources. So it also had a knock-on effect on the beat journalist. So we saw really the beat journalist die. And more and more journalists just going back to reporting whatever was, you know, the breaking story of the day, politics, or the other sexier stories that will obviously sort of, what's the word, overtake your general health story. And this meant for me, it's been harder. It was harder for the past, I'd say, how many years? 4 years. It's been very hard to motivate for health stories against this backdrop. And of course, I mean, the bigger health stories you do get to cover. You do the life testimonies, you do what's already in the public sphere. But I'm talking about the smaller health story of a patient being refused access to treatment or surgery. Those needed real backing in our diary meetings. And those were the stories that I fell in love with when I started my health reporting. I fell in love with those stories because of the interface it gave me with ordinary people, just like myself. Ordinary people at their most vulnerable. So, yeah, it's been a very tough journey as a health journalist in this industry. And it's a fight that we keep fighting every day.
That's very interesting, Avuyo, because like as somebody who comes from a background of, I've been a health journalist in donor-funded media organizations, you know, where the priority is health stories all the time. But I do also understand, like when we look at the larger media landscape, where health stories that are not tragedies like life testimony or that are not, that don't overtake kind of like the news cycle, kind of get swept under the carpet, where you've written a brilliant story, even in the newsrooms we come from. And I'll pass it on to Dylan and Spo, who've been working in donor-funded health news organizations as well for a while, where, yes, in your newsroom, they're being taken seriously, and we appreciate them. But when you look at the larger media landscape, like, are people reading the story? Are people engaging in the story? Are other media organizations even picking up on the story and taking it further? we see very little of that. And I think you raised a very good point around the financing of the media industry, right? There's been a lot of some newsrooms have closed down, but there's very little money that newsrooms have at the moment. And the last place many newsrooms or many editors make a decision to take it is health or science or other very niche beats like climate, reporting on the environment or climate change. And we kind of like the collateral damage of a financially strapped media landscape, you know. But then what happens when you get money injected from philanthropies, from organizations that are saying, hey, we like these development issues, we want to know more, we want to give you a budget or allow you or enable you to be able to report on these very important issues, because public health is linked, you know, to the well-being of South Africans or of people. We can say so much from knowing what is happening. How then do you balance having editorial independence, reporting on the issues on the ground in your societies, in your communities, in the country, while being donor funded?
I think Vuyo just mentioned such an important thing for us. I mean, Healthy has been around for about 20 years now, and from where we were and from where we are now, and just talking about donor funding, is that the cycle of donor funding is a major issue, and it does have a lot to do with what do you report, what do you prioritize. But I think from our side, we've often taken a stance of saying, you know, what is important for South Africa. And I think I'm just going to go back to, again, how do we make health a political issue? And I think this is where civil society comes in, right? And I think when I think about Health E, back in the 90s, we wouldn't have done this work, like reported on HIV the way we did, if we didn't partner with organizations like the Treatment Action Campaign, because they had the science, right? And it's civil society, it's academics that were able to give us that information. But just to go back to the donor funding, I think now we find ourselves in a very complex place, because there is the issue of the donor funding where the cycle is different, right? At some point, donors will be interested in looking at gender and health, right? And you'll see there'll be a lot of donors wanting you guys to actually focus more stories on gender and health. And then, I mean, Life is Sidimeni, when you look at it, it was a mental health issue. But we were struggling to find a donor that can fund mental health issue stories. So you find yourself having to either trying to balance of what the donor wants, but also having to actually say, no, this is an important issue for South Africa. So how we find ourselves. But I think the most important thing also to highlight is that the mainstream media also controls our narrative, especially because we are a news agency. So what we used to do at Health E, we used to love writing long form stories, and especially mixing the grassroots stories with research. But what we're finding is that, you know, mainstream media do not want those stories. They want quick 300-word stories, very short. So the state that we find ourselves in is very hard. But I mean, the donors do have an influence in what kind of stories that you want. And I think Dylan will actually
okay, so donor funding, I think, comes with complications of its own. I think it is the way forward, and I think it definitely, I mean, I know we're very lucky, unlike your experience, but I come from your experience because I was also news and politics. I didn't want to be a health journalist. I kind of fell into this. So I was also news and politics for Mail and Guardian for like many, many years. And then I moved on into the NGO sector, and coming back into the donor funding news space, it was different for me because, as Paul said, the donors want certain things. Now, while we are still allowed to cover whatever we want to, for us, we have targets. And you can cover, like, you can be interested in all the things, but you also only have a finite amount of time. Yeah. And I know for me, like, I struggle because my targets and what I'm probably most interested in sometimes don't always overlap. So you'll see I'm going to talk, I mean, okay, I was lucky with these two, like I'm going to be talking about NSP-related stuff and sex workers and drug addicts and things like that, but mostly they want us to do very specific kinds of stories, and we have to find, like, juggle our time to, like, make ourselves happy and tell all the stories that we want to tell, and also keep the donors happy. But yeah, and maintain sort of editorial independence, which I mean, I think that our donors are quite good with that. They can't like prescribe well what we cover and how we cover it, but like I said, we do have the targets. But I just also like I think we call ourselves niche journalists, and I just wanted to say, I mean, we do it ourselves. You know, oh, we're such a niche; it's so small, and I think that's what's been programmed into us. But I think where we're moving now, that's quite stupid because health is relevant to everyone, and almost every story that you read can, you know, be related back to health. So, and especially where we're going now with climate change and the imminent end of the world, health is pretty important, you know, and shouldn't be sort of filed at the back of the paper anymore because, you know, it's not back page stuff. So, yeah, that's my
Thank
thoughts.
you so much for that. You're right. It's not back page stuff, you know, and just kind of like linking everything, you know. Mark, you have like the institutional kind of knowledge in the room regarding like the fight for like HIV medication and just also being involved with Michael Komabe, the water and sanitation case in Limpopo, and also Life is Dimeni. You know, from you as somebody who's an activist and also has been so prominent in the media, what has been your observation of how health journalism has shifted over the past 2 decades?
Sure.
Sorry.
Well, the first thing is it's very interesting to hear this introspection and to sit with health journalists, because there's an interesting relationship between us and you. You know, I fight for the right to health, the constitutional right to health. But my ability to advance the constitutional right to health depends upon often how well the media does its job. It depends upon your exercising your rights of freedom of press, access to information, etc., etc. But it's also, we're in a bit of a vicious circle because we're sitting on this platform, raised platform with, you know, the best health journalists in the country, and there's a few others out there, but there's not many. And as Dylan and various other people have said, health is treated as a niche issue. And what frustrates me as an activist and as a citizen in the broad term of the word, not South African citizen, is that health impacts on every aspect of life. And so when I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking, you know, we've been asked to speak about the 10 biggest health stories. Then I thought, but what is a health story, actually? Because quite often health stories are stories that report the symptoms, the health symptoms, and not the causes of the symptoms. And by reporting only the symptoms, actually we're never able to get to the cause. I'm coming to the specific answer to your question in a second. And the other thing, to go back to this vicious circle, is that health doesn't become an issue until it's a story. But it doesn't become a story unless it's an issue. So how do we break out of that vicious circle? Because it's only when it becomes an issue that it often gets attention. So mental health wouldn't have got attention if it wasn't for Life Esidimeni. And whether it's getting attention now is a question in and of itself, because I think, and I challenge the journalists here to tell us that, and it's just been said, you can focus on it for a time, and then you stop focusing on it and it stops being an issue, and the problem remains. The maltreatment, the indignity, the torture of mental health, people living with mental illnesses continues to this day. People dying, etc., people being treated in an undignified way, people being tortured, degraded. So I think those are some of our challenges. I think, you know, to answer your question, has there been a positive development in 20 years? It's positive that we have, you know, Health E and Vuyo and Bekisisa and so on. I might disagree with Dylan as to whether, you know, donor-funded health reporting is a positive thing in and of itself. I mean, often it's these philanthro-capitalists who cause the problems that exist in the world, including then leading to mass anxiety, mass depression, a whole number of things, and then they bring in Health E to tell the story, with no disrespect to Health E. So there's a lot of complexity in this, but there are great journalists reporting health, but there is not great journalism covering the health story. It is so partial, it is so incomplete, it is so disconnected and fragmented that I'm on all of your sides, but I'm trying to, in a sense, do what you're doing as well, which is just provoke.
No, I cannot actually argue with anything that Mark has said regarding like the politics and the complexities of donor funding and what it actually means in a greater, like when we look at it from a larger like space instead of just from journalism, this money for journalism, you know. And like we've been saying, Dylan, Spo, and I come from donor-funded organizations. And for example, where Dylan works at Big CISA Center for Health Journalism, they have a very, I don't want to say a focus, like Dylan was saying that you cover everything, but there are targets that you need to meet about certain issues, right? And Dylan's just going to tell us a little bit about some of the biggest stories that they covered and why. And for me, what's interesting about that is like trying to use these capitalists to do other work that they don't necessarily want you to do, and how you kind of like, you know, disrupt using the master's tools, so if you so have it. So Dylan, would you tell us some of the work that the biggest stories that got attention at Big CISA and in the larger media landscape that you guys focused on in the past year?
Sure. And just also to answer you, I think I agree with you. Donor funding is very complicated, but from the perspective of coming from the Mail and Guardian and working there and hearing, we don't have funds for you to travel to cover this story. We don't have funds for you to do this. We don't have, and people are getting retrenched, and, Mail and Guardian went through that awful period for a while. Money is hard in journalism, and I think when I got sort of lured back into Becky CISA from the NGO sector after having that experience at MNG, where, and MNG is a great publication, but, it's hard to survive. It's nice to be able to come back into a newsroom and be able to breathe and not be worried about, is my salary going to come in time for my debit orders and things like that. So I hear you, and I didn't mean to say like donor funding is just like the answer to everything. But onto my actual thing is, I'm going to be talking to you today about what I covered last year and what I think were quite important. And for me last year was about morals versus evidence, and how morals win, and they shouldn't. So the two controversial topics I'll be addressing is the decriminalization of sex work, and harm reduction programs for injecting drug users. But both of these are under moralistic attack from like general society, despite the evidence that the overwhelming evidence that there is to back it up. So what do I mean by a moralistic attack, right? Morals are standards of behaviors or principles of right and wrong, and while they are beneficial in some respects, when people follow them blindly, they can be very dangerous. So I'm going to share with you some indisputable evidence. You might have heard of it. You might have heard some of it already, about how decriminalizing sex work and providing harm reduction programs for injecting drug users can actually be hugely beneficial, particularly in the fight against HIV. But most people in society, when confronted with this evidence, tend to wring their hands and freak out and have all their own
Talk about God.
Yes, talk about God. We have the same things with abortion. And I know this because I also read the comments that I get when my stories come through. So, yes. Because I hate myself, Beth. I don't. So, it's what we're kind of up against all the time. So I'm going to start with sex work. We in South Africa have up to 182,000 sex workers in the country. Those are like male, female, and transgender. But of that number, 121 to 176,000 are women. Okay. And research shows that sex workers, particularly female sex workers and female sex workers working in a country where sex work is illegal, are far more likely to contract HIV than other women in that same country. And this is not just because of like the higher number of sexual partners, right? It is also because of like they're way more likely to be exposed to violent sex or to being forced to have sex without a condom or raped. I mean, that's rape. So the violence and the fear of violence results in them giving much higher priority to their safety, obviously, than it does to them prioritizing, prevention of HIV. It makes sense. You can die or you're going to get HIV, Yeah. So not to mention that sex workers operating in countries where it is illegal, they have no legal recourse. Think about it. They are illegal. So they get raped. They get beaten up. Who do they go to? But what makes it, and then, well, I guess some sex workers do try to report, right? But then overwhelmingly the police are saying, well, you're sex workers, and then they arrest them, It's a vicious cycle. So, leads me to Sweat and Sonke Gender Justice released a report recently, or last year sometime, called The Policing of Sex Work in South Africa. And it was horrific. And it was these things that made headlines last year. It was what came out of that. And the scary thing that came out of this report was that in South Africa, sex workers are far more afraid of the police than they are of their violent clients. The police are the ones who are raping them. The police are the ones who are murdering them. The police are the ones who are beating them up, taking away their condoms, making them eat their own, used condoms. I mean, horrific, horrific things.
And even arresting them while they're off duty,
Yeah.
literally manhunting them in malls and arresting them when they're with their children. It's quite something.
Yeah, no, it really, really is. So, and these are crimes that they can never, ever report, because how do you report to the police that the police are harassing you? It doesn't work. So they also live in constant fear, right? Because under the current laws, anyone who's living off of the earnings of sex work can also be arrested. And sex workers in this country are supporting between 3 and 9 people each. All right? So they're never going to report, and they live in constant fear. Now, if people's access to basic human rights and the right to just feel safe and access to health and all of that is not enough of compelling evidence as to why we should decrim, then let's look at some figures, right? Back to the numbers. HIV infection rates among South Africa's estimated 138,000 female sex workers are atrocious. In Durban, it is just under half of female sex workers have HIV, and in Johannesburg, that number jumps up to just under 3/4. Or just over 3/4, I apologize. Countrywide, 70% of female sex workers are infected with HIV. And 1 in every 6 new HIV infections can be traced back to sex work. So it's important. So scientists argue, right, that decriminalizing sex work, which means the removal of all laws governing consensual adult sex work, has the potential to avert more infections than any other HIV prevention strategy for sex workers and their clients. Over the next decade, over the next 10 years, right? They say decriminalization can prevent a third to almost half of the world's new infections, because of the combined effects of the decriminalization would have on violence, police harassment, safer work environments, and HIV transmission pathways. Okay, so this makes sense, right? Because if sex workers feel safe and sex workers can report violence against them, can report a rape, can report, then the clients are less likely to be violent, the police are less likely to be it just makes common sense. You become a valid human being in the world, you have rights, you can go and exercise those rights, you have recourse, yeah. But they don't, so you don't have to take my word for this, right? So in the Netherlands, Amsterdam, and we all know Amsterdam, it's legalized there. And in July last year, they released figures of their HIV infection rates amongst their sex workers. The female sex workers in the Netherlands, there are 0.5% of their female sex workers have HIV. All right, now, obviously, legalization and decriminalization are two different models, and legalization has its own set of complications. Here in South Africa, we are fighting for decriminalization. I'm not going to talk about all the legal models. There are 4 of them, and they become complicated. But the point is, right, what you can see from this is you give people rights, and you recognize that what they're doing is real work, and it drastically reduces HIV rates. You know, it's kind of a no-brainer for me. So back to South Africa, right? Activists here say that decriminalization was a prominent part of the National Strategic Plan for HIV, TB, and STIs. We're currently in the 2017 to 2022 iteration of it. And activists provided a lot of input for that strategic plan, and decriminalization was a big factor in it. But somewhere between where the activists provided the input and when Cabinet finalized it, decrim disappeared, right? Yeah. So, you know, I guess what has happened is like morals, politics, and conservatism have trumped cold, hard evidence. Morals versus evidence. Okay, so even if you don't agree with sex work, right? Even if you have your own moral little belief in your heart, fine. But surely you agree that A, everybody deserves the right to health, to safety, to, you know, to be able to go to the police and report crimes against them, right? Yeah, and everyone should recognize that, you know, surely curbing South Africa's HIV infection rates is far more important than your moral beliefs. You know, anyway. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. You know, and I love the T-shirt that Dylan is wearing right now, and I'll just read it up for anyone who can't see what it's written. And it's like, what do we want? Evidence. When do we want it? After peer review. Because I mean, science, right? But you know, with the topic of sex work, and just to like chime into what you were saying and where we fit in as the media. You know, last year or the year before, the South African Law Reform Commission released their recommendations, which activists again had to kind of like beat out of the government, right? And in there, they even call sex work. They don't call it sex work in the whole document. They call it prostitution, which kind of tells us the political stance or the moralistic stance of our government when it comes to sex work, right? And they use words as it cannot be recognized as decent work, right? And, you know, and then when we look at our kind of like where we come in as the media and how we report about sex work, I'm more interested in the images that we use, you know. I cringe every time I read a story about sex work, whether it's about a sex worker who was violently assaulted or like whatever. It's always a picture of a woman in a miniskirt on a road in a dark alley, right? And this is where we come in and how, you know, we are part of the problem, you know. A lot of the times, the biggest issue, like when I've written about sex work that I've realized is that images, and I know, Dylan, you're a multimedia journalist, and if you can talk to us about like the challenges that you see in terms of how do we portray this very important issue and these people who we are trying to advocate through our writing that they are human, they deserve the dignity that we get, and what they do for work should not matter, in a way that is visually like accurate, and also but also doesn't infringe against their dignity. And where's the balance between getting an image that you know is going to get a click, right? Because we know when we have an image of
are those even going to get clicks anymore? I mean, we've all seen pictures of the woman leaning into a car door like with a short skirt. I don't know if they're like so compelling anymore. It's 2019. It's, you know, let's move beyond that. You know, it's complicated. I am about to release finally a documentary I've been working on sex workers. But in the lead up to it, there've been a few things that we've released. And I mean, I've been trying to do this very thing that you're talking about, and not obviously there are some images of women in skirts in the thing, but not many, because mostly they're of them doing their day-to-day things. So I went to where they live, under a bridge in Cape Town. And there were many shots of them just where they live, doing their things, having their tea, having a chat, you know, because they're human beings. And it was very important for me to show that like, these are human beings. They are, you know, we think of, like, when we generalize, you know, when we make like a clump of people like this, we don't think of them about like their lives and their day to day. And so one of the things I've tried to do is, one of the stories I've told is about someone named Joan Collins. Joan Collins is an ICU nurse in Cape Town, or she was. But Joan Collins, the entire time, she was an ICU nurse in Cape Town. She was not making enough money because of apartheid, and she was getting very little, and it was just, you know, that sign of the times. But so she was doing sex work on the side. And that story did really, really well. And there's no picture of a miniskirt. There's no, the promo picture, the one that you click on, is not of her standing in a miniskirt. It's of her standing quite proudly on the side of a hill. But people will still watch it. So I think it's just lazy. I think if you use that, and I also understand that sometimes you just need a picture and stock images. If you look in any wire service and you put in sex work, that's what you get. And it's also, I guess, easily identifiable. But I would challenge journalists to try something else, because there are other ways. And I mean, this Joan Collins story is one that proves that people will still click. You know, you can still put sex worker in the title. People will click it. Clickbait. And I would hope that showing people, you know, yes, your ICU nurse is just trying to make ends meet, because that's the other thing, is that we stigmatize who sex workers are. There's this idea that all sex workers, and this is a complicated thing, because a lot of sex workers are forced into it, and it is awful, and you know, it's not a happy profession, but there are those that are happy in it, you know. And I know of a few UCT students who are supporting themselves and paying for their tuition through sex work. So I think that's the thing. We need to get past this idea of like the one idea of what a sex worker looks like. Yeah.
I think that's quite important, and I know you want to like get into harm reduction and show the video.
Yeah.
But this involves us moving.
Oh wait, I'm not there yet.
Oh.
I talk for a bit more,
Okay.
and then I.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm nearly done. I feel like I'm waffling. I did time this, and it didn't go over 15 minutes.
Okay, so I was just going to say, because of the logistics of the screen, can we show the documentary at the end, at the end of
no, it is at the
everything?
end of
Yeah,
what I'm saying.
all right,
Yeah,
awesome.
perfect. So yeah, that brings me to the next topic, right? Which is another set of people that we like to stigmatize, and that's injecting drug users living on the street. You know, and how many times? I mean, I saw it just the other day on the I Love Melville group, Facebook group. You know, somebody was appealing for help, and the first thing she said was, you know, I'm not a drug addict, I'm not an alcoholic. You know, please give me money, please help me. And that really upsets me, because I'm like, you know, whether you are a drug user or an alcoholic, you're still a person. Yeah, you're still a person, and you went through some shit that got you there, and you didn't ask for it. Nobody. As a 4-year-old, when you ask a 4-year-old what they want to do when they grow up, nobody says, I want to grow up and live on the streets and be a heroin user, yeah? Yeah, so, I mean, I think we just need to be a bit kinder. But yeah, and so our attitudes with drug users is that they, especially heroin users, is that we should just lock them in a dungeon and throw away the key, and they must go through the withdrawals, and when they're done with that, then we can let them out. This is super naive and super dangerous. Because what we fail to understand is that the users on the street, especially the heroin users, and regardless of how they got there, when they are living on the street and they are using heroin, they are not getting high, they are stopping withdrawals. Withdrawals can be deadly at times, they are awful. It is sick to want to make somebody go through withdrawals. The physical pain is incredible. That is not doing no harm, right? That is not a nice thing to do to someone. And heroin users living on the street are desperate for their next fix. Like, they just want to keep the withdrawals away. And so they're more prone to sharing needles, right? Which brings the HIV problem, right? But not only HIV, the other thing that is other bloodborne diseases, but hepatitis C is something that we actually never speak about and is quite a big concern, especially among injecting drug users. So in countries where they've introduced harm reduction programs, right, guess what I'm going to say? HIV infection rates have drastically dropped, right? So I'll tell you what harm reduction is. So needle exchange programs are when we go out and you give clean and free needles to users on the street. So they swap out their used ones and you give them the clean ones, right? The other form is called opioid substitution therapy, and this is where users eventually will get to a point where they will stop using the heroin and they'll swap it out for another opioid, so like methadone, right? As an example, methadone won't get you high, but it will stop the withdrawals, right? So harm reduction has in the places where they have introduced it, it reduces drug-related crime. So the opposite, because people are always like, oh, you know, the drug addicts will come, we give them needles, the crime will go up. No, it reduces crime and it reduces overdoses and deaths, right? How did this happen? In the news last year. Last year, I don't know if you know of TB HIV Care. They're an NGO operating in Durban. They were handing out, they were the only needle exchange program in Durban. And due to a freak storm that happened in about May last year, a bunch of dirty needles were washed up onto the beachfront. Immediately, TB HIV Care was blamed, and they shut down the program. Now, there are many reasons why those needles could have come up. Firstly, they never proved that the needles came from TB HIV Care or that they were the heroin users' needles. But even if they were, TB HIV Care will pick up the needles on a specific day. So the users might have buried them in the sand for safekeeping until that day came. You know, it's not to say that they were just irresponsibly throwing away their needles. In fact, evidence shows that that's not what happens in needle exchange programs at all, because if you don't give them enough clean needles, dirty needles, they won't give you your clean needles back. Sorry, I've lost my place now. Oh, sorry, TB. Okay. I'm nearly done. We're going to get to the video now, hey? So I spent, now I'm going to stop talking about this because clearly I've lost my train of thought, but I'm going to show you a video that I did and that I released last year. And it's about Marco. I spent a year with Marco, and I think that you can't really argue with this. I spent a year with him from the time where he was on the streets and injecting the heroin to now where he is off the streets and working for Harmless and in the methadone program. And really my overall thing is when we give people rights and we start to treat them like human beings, things get better for society and for them. And why wouldn't we do that? And why do we let morals win?
Just for logistic reasons, because people have to move, we'll play it at the end as we wrap up the panel and open for question and answer and interaction with the audience, And evidence over morals, right? Which is such a big issue when we think about also what morals have done, how morals impact on everyday life issues. Right, for instance, when we talk about gender-based violence, it seems morals kind of go out of the window. There's no really focus on us being good humans when we talk about gender-based violence, or when we talk about, we see it as well when we talk about abortion, where morals are also then swung in our faces. And I like to say, okay, if you don't want abortion,
telling you to have an abortion.
Get one,
Nobody's telling you to become a sex worker.
Exactly. So it's and it's also navigating the space. We're talking about sexual reproductive health, which has been an issue that has taken precedence over the past 2 years in the media. And this is because of also, again, civil society, organizations like the Sexual Reproductive Justice Coalition, and individual activists like Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who've really been advocating for the access to safe abortion, and also the Total Shutdown Movement, who we know last year, they were newsmakers last year with their unprecedented protest in August, right? So when we talk about these, I'm opening it up now, and I'm going to put someone else on the spot, Spo, sorry. I hope this doesn't come bite me in the ass when we get back to the office today. But so when we talk about these issues, right, what do we, what does it say? And have we done justice to it as the media in consistently talking about sexual reproductive health, not just when there's a scandal, not just when there's a big protest coming, not when there's another Karabo Mokoena who has been murdered and is trending on Twitter. Have we done justice to these, consistently covering these issues?
I think one of the things that I've seen I think last year there was a change in narrative when we look at gender-based violence. I'll just start with gender-based violence. I think for a longest time when media reported on gender-based violence, it was this woman who obviously as a victim, right, and was abused, but it was always in a narrative that it was the responsibility of this woman to get out of that relationship. And I think it didn't highlight two important things, our stories. We didn't highlight the aspect of what is the role of government, right, in protecting its citizens. And secondly, then also looking at then what about the one who perpetrates, right? And I think for a longest time, the stories have been about that. We've been writing stories about why did she stay in this relationship? She's been in the, I mean, some of the features that we've been writing for years, right, have been looking at that. And I think then last year, I think there was a shift because now we were looking at what policies do we have? Where are we lacking when it comes to gender-based violence? And I think, again, for me, where we're still missing it as the media is that as much as government, I mean, we saw the gender-based the GBV summit, right? So the total shutdown had a march. Great, again, we didn't unpack what the march meant for us, right? And then again, there was the summit. And I feel like with the summit, I mean, there were commitments that were made. But where's the media in looking at those commitments? Are we analyzing it? Are we looking at critically, can we achieve this? What does it mean when government comes up with a strategy? I think again, just with the sexual reproductive health, I don't know how many, there's an adolescent reproductive health strategy that was done in 2012, 2014, and it has aims and all these, but then again, we as journalists, it's our duty to go back and look at where are we with these strategies? Where's the money? Where's the budget? And I think we don't do that enough. What we do, and I think it's important to tell the human story, right? But again, how are we telling the human story also needs to change, right? Because it's the narrative has been around women, you get yourself into this, right? And when you look at abortion, right, there's still a very conservative also way at which we report on it, right? And I think last year I saw quite a lot of change, and it was coming again from Becky Sisa and Health E, where we were looking at destigmatizing abortion, where you're finding a young woman who is middle class who are saying, I want to do an abortion. And I think we need more stories like that, where it says, it doesn't further make young women hide because they feel that it's so wrong. You only do it because you are poor, and again, it's your fault. You shouldn't be having sex, right? And again, I think the narrative also needs to change around your sexual reproductive health. You have a right to have sex, and whatever age. So I think we also need to critically analyze the language of the policies, and also critique that, and also then form different narratives. So I think, but it's changing. I must say. I mean, looking at the media reports lately and looking at some of the features that you do, but again, it's not enough, right? It's again when there's a big story, when there's a GBV summit, then you'll see some of the journalists flocking in, and then it's only Ponzo who will after that critically analyze. Like for instance, the zero VAT. The zero rating in sanitary pads, right? It was announced last year in November, and it's supposed to come in April. I want to see how many journalists are going to report on that, or will that story just get missed, or will it be just one sponsor? No, I'm just saying, why do we? It's health only. I mean, Mark said it, right? Health comes and it's a big story, and then we forget, and then that's it. When do we ever go back and actually look at what we said? I remember in 2011, right? There was a hate crime task team that was formed. Remember that? Where is it that? Where's the budget for that? And I think, again, I'm just going to bring in education. We're going to see it with the Fees Must Fall issue. That, we're going to see it with the Life as City Many thing, that government now knows, the ANC government knows that, no, you know what, how you do it. You just call this media and say, oh, we have a strategy. And then when you have a strategy, the media writes, we have this big strategy. Now things are great. Condom in schools, right? It was announced. The minister said we will have an implementation of condoms in schools. Where are the condoms in schools? We are missing those stories as health journalists.
I think the issues that you're raising are quite poignant, right, Spo? And as in my experience, I'll just give anecdotal evidence, if there's such a thing, where in terms of the sexual reproductive health in schools, right? So last year the announcement was made. I missed it because I'm not really an education reporter, but I caught wind of it mid-June last year. And so I made a diary, I made a reminder on my Gmail that next year in Feb ask about the implementation. So the Department of Basic Education announced that, you know, the policy of sexual reproductive health in school is going to be implemented. And they're training educators and parents about this. You know, it's this la-di-da, we're doing things, siyakuba type of thing. And so I was quite interested to see the results, because I saw all my colleagues were reporting on this thing is going to happen. So I made a reminder to say, like, this year, Feb, ask if this thing happened and what's the progress, what it's looking like. So when is HIV testing actually going to happen in schools? And I kid you not, from January until late Feb and mid-March, I've been waiting for the Department of Education to answer me. They simply ignore my calls, ignore my emails. They are not answering. They are just ignoring me. And yet, when they have a chance to go on the radio or on other media platforms to talk about other issues, they run, right? And it's like, and I hear that we as journalists need to be able to hold the government accountable. But like what Mark was saying earlier on about how do we hold people who do not even give us access to the information? We need to hold them accountable, right? And this is a bigger, this is a larger issue of journalism and not just health and just health reporting. But it's extremely important in these cases where, as health journalists, we are not allowed to go into a hospital or a clinic or even a school without getting the district, district officer or head of HOD to give you a letter that you will produce when you get to the school gate to be like, I have the right to be here, you know. And it's this kind of the villainization of the media as a whole, but also the downright prohibition of information to journalists, because our politicians exist in a world where they don't want to be held accountable. And how does that then feed into, you know, earlier on we were talking about health is everything. It's not just this, it's not the root cause, it's not the fruits that we see, but it's in everyday life then. So to you, Mark, I asked then, how do we then deal with these institutional barriers to being able to do our work that speak to larger issues in society about leaders that don't want to be held accountable for the policies or the actions that they make, or like how do we bypass that system? And in many cases, a lot of times, it's collaboration between civil society and media organizations that does that. You guys go into rooms that we are never allowed into. But how do we make that the norm and not the exception in these situations?
I think you answered the question already. Look, it has to be about the connection between activism and journalism, and it's a mutually reinforcing relationship. You dig up stories, sometimes independently of activism, that then creates an agenda for activism around the rights to health. But sometimes we create the stories that then get the media attention, that then enable that issue to be taken forward. And AIDS is the best example of that. Although, perhaps we'll come to this later, I would ask the question, and it may link to what you said in your introduction, why is AIDS not a story anymore? You know, given the number of new HIV infections still in this country, given the number of AIDS-related deaths, given growing evidence of poor adherence to antiretroviral medicines, given the impact, as somebody said to me, you know, we prevented HIV infection in a generation of children, babies, infants, when we won on mother-to-child transmission. That same generation now is now 15 and 16 and 17 and 18 and is getting HIV infected for the very reasons that you are talking about. No condoms in school, no decent life orientation. If you were to do a journalistic story on the quality of sex education, life education, the same prejudices that if you talk about sex, you'll be encouraging sex when kids are already having sex at a younger and younger age, the same myths, the same so-called morals in inverted commas. And I guess this is a dialogue we have to have, not just here, because there are structural barriers to getting this information. There's a thing called the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Everybody knows about it. In reality, it should be called the Prevention of Access to Information Act. Because it is used to block access to information. You make a request for critical information, and then you're told, PIRE it. And PIRE has a whole process of time frames that you must wait, letters that you must write. You know, if you are, and I understand journalists are often under deadlines, you can't wait 30 days. You don't necessarily have the resources or the capacity to go through a whole process. But sometimes if you say, no, go to hell, we have a right to this information. I was just chatting to some colleagues at Section 27 yesterday. You push, then you get the information. Sometimes you don't, sometimes you do. Or you know somebody who's higher up in the health department. We will go to the DG and we'll say to the DG, who is generally civil society friendly and understands the constitution, constitutional responsibilities, this is how these people are behaving down here, and then she'll make it happen. But that is how government really ought to be operating. But it's also, you know, it brings into question the roles of other role players. So, for example, I've been trying to have a meeting with Bongani Majola for a few months, the chair of the Human Rights Commission, who's a good person. But I want to know from Bongani why the Human Rights Commission about a decade ago gave up on its constitutional power to get annual reports from government departments on socio-economic rights. They just don't do it. They just don't provide the information that they are constitutionally obligated to provide. Now, if they were providing that information, then Bekasisa and City Press could be picking through and finding the stories and being able to report on a much more consistent basis on what is going on. So, you know, there's a lot of things, I believe, that could be done to create a climate of greater openness. And it's so critical for democracy and so critical for civic space. And I'm doing some research at the moment for the UN Office on High Commission on Human Rights about this trend, which we're well aware of across Southern Africa, to close the space. Close the space for journalism, close the space for access to information. And it may not be happening in South Africa by virtue of a law, as was envisaged a few years ago, that intends to close the space, but sometimes there are other more subtle ways of closing down access to information that is the oxygen. And good journalism is the oxygen for the right to health, and perhaps we'll come to it a little bit later on. But you know, as I keep saying, my big bugbear is this issues that are not getting media attention and therefore don't become stories.
No, definitely. You know, I mean, when you talk about like the HIV having been the forgotten story of this year or the past few years, Media Monitoring Africa earlier this month or last month released a report where they compared HIV reporting between 2012, 2013 and 2018, and there has been a significant drop. I forgot the numbers, but I think it was like from 60% to about 20% drop in HIV in the media, right? And this is both frightening, but also indicative of why, it maybe begs us to ask the question why this is the case right now in South Africa, where we've kind of put HIV in the back burner. And this goes to talking about what happens in the mainstream of society, not media, but of society, where like you and I, or in my group of friends, talking about HIV, on finding out that a friend is on ARVs is not the end of the world. Like, it's, of course, it's not always the wanted thing, but it's not, it's quite normal, right? But late last year, I was in KZN for a story, and we drove to this woman's house, and literally the whole community came out and were asking us, and we didn't look like journalists, you know, like, because we knew the area that we're going to is very like heavy with stigma. We already kind of briefed, and so we didn't have a branded car or anything, but everyone wanted to know. And then this woman was telling me her son was, her 14-year-old son was HIV positive, and when they found out, they were going back and forth between the clinic and their house. And neighbors were asking, why are you going to the clinic so often? And she had to lie and say that, no, he's got like an ear infection or something like that. They had to come up with a lie. Because outside of the areas or the lives that we inhabit here, like us in this room, right, where talking about these issues is normal, sort of, right? When we go back home to our rural areas, to our townships, where stigma still persists, where we have studies that are being released that there are women, like, even though obesity rates are going so high and there's now this push against NCDs, women are choosing not to lose weight because they associate being thin with HIV, an illness, right? And I'm just gonna pass the ball to you again, Spo, who has, like in the past year, you've been working on like NCDs and obesity prevention. And how do we manage these, how do we manage the perceptions that communities have, right? And that people have around these issues. Like, for instance, we're saying, people say, no, I don't want, you know, when you've gained weight, no matter how big you are, people are like, oh, you must have money. You're living a nice life. And how do we balance the importance of obesity, talking about preventing obesity, talking about, because we think obesity is this issue of lifestyle. Go to the gym, drink water with lemon, and you'll be fit, you know? And to this issue about malnutrition, this issue about inequality, this issue about land. So how do we then, as health reporters, or how have we, rather, as health reporters, as journalists, kind of covered this issue as a human issue, as a health issue, instead of this lifestyle aesthetic issue?
I think you just highlight, like, so obesity is very tricky. And for somebody who has worked on an obesity campaign, I've often thought that in a country like South Africa, I would move from saying obesity, but actually focusing on the disease itself, that what does obesity lead to, right? Because you just highlighted such important things, that the weight issue, right? How we perceive ourselves culturally, you know, there's a whole lot of cultural effect. I mean, I know coming from home, whenever I lose weight, it's such a huge issue. Everybody will ask me, what's going on? I mean, eat more pap, you know? And therefore, you know, I think when we look at the obesity issue, you look at it from the NCDs. And just to go back, and I think Mark highlighted such an important thing around HIV, is that there's such a perception that we've won that struggle, right? And now people have treatment, and that's it. And there's quite a lot with HIV. And I mean, HIV is one of my biggest passions. And I was so excited, actually, that South Africa is going to be introducing a new drug called dolutegravir. But nobody was rejoicing. Nobody. It's such a strong drug. It's better than one of the drugs that is causing mental health issues that we all talk about. But we didn't say anything. Instead, there was a study that came out around that it's causing birth defects in Botswana. And my suspicions is that they didn't want to get it into South Africa. But anyway, let's move on into NCDs. And I think, again, I'm just going to highlight something about NCDs. When you look at the global fund in terms of globally, in terms of development aid, it's NCD is like less than 10% of global funding into health goes into NCDs. So automatically we have a crisis. In South Africa, I mean, recently we just found out that the leading causes of deaths are now NCDs, and HIV is actually dropping in NCD. Oh, sorry. You know, when you work on an issue, you forget. So it's got non-communicable diseases. And it's just, they usually just put it in as, you know, your cancer, your high blood pressure, your diabetes, and it's usually diseases that can be preventable. And I think from our side as Health E, we realized when we saw these rates are increasing, and we've been trying to actually look at this issue. But I think one thing we missed was looking at it from, and I think Ponzo highlighted it, that for the longest time when we talk about these diseases, when we talk about especially diabetes type 2, and we talk about hypertension, I mean, in South Africa, you know, I mean, and not to say it wrong, but most of black women have high blood pressure, have hypertension, have type 2 diabetes. And what we see, and we're looking at the stats are looking very, 70% of black women are actually overweight, right? And now it's increasing, 40% of us are actually even obese. And we are worried that, you know, when you look at it and you look at HIV also, what happens when you have to treat these two things? And these diseases are preventable. And we've been trying to look at how do you cover these issues. And I think for the longest time, I think Ponzo highlighted this, that the narrative again in the media, the stories that we've been writing around this, I mean, in the past was around, you have the duty again. It's you who has to exercise. And this again, it's you have to eat right. And you're telling this to a mother who is staying in a squatter camp, has no access to land, has no access has no money to even go for exercise, to a gym. And we started looking at, so what is it exactly that we are missing? And I think one of the main thing again is how the media, we are still afraid of being critical of private sector, right? And it, again, coming into access to medicine, right? When it comes to HIV, when it comes to hypertension, NCDs, cancer treatment, I think Mark, I think Section 27 and TAC are starting a campaign around cancer, access to cancer treatment and things like that, but we're not critically analyze the private sector. And what we thought was that, I mean, looking at the NCD issue is that there's a lot of research that is showing that food, right, in a place where, in a developing country like South Africa, where food is a major thing, and if you look at now with globalization, right, your big McDonald's are coming in, and also we have issues around undernutrition, right, and hunger issues. So now this gap of access to healthy food is being filled by multinationals who KFC is filling, right? McDonald's, right? So now, and also the perception of how they sell their products, Coca-Cola, of how they sell their products. And we were particularly interested in looking at when the minister announced, I mean, the minister is very big on health prevention, and I agree with him that, you know, when it comes to NCDs, you know, when you look at the health budget, we need to prevent these diseases because of currently our public healthcare system will not be able to look at it. And I think we started telling stories of what can we do, and we moved our narrative from looking at it's a responsibility of an individual. We started looking at the environment, and when we started looking at the environment, we saw how the food industry, the beverage industry manipulates everybody, and how they use advertising and how they use and we started looking at stories. And then what we did was we started really writing stories that look at, you know, access to healthy food. What are the complexities? You know, we were doing a lot of stories, and also looking at alternatives, that there are alternatives groups like the Food Sovereignty in South Africa that are looking at, so what is the alternative? There's urban farmers in Yeoville, right, who are providing healthy meals, you know, and those stories are not told. And I think from our side, Ponzo, it was looking at the non-communicable diseases from an environment perspective, and looking at how do we tell stories that it doesn't say to you it's your fault, but it's actually the industry. I don't know, do you want me to get into some of the work that we did?
No, so I think you've been touching
Okay.
on it as you're going into
Okay.
it, and I think like at the bigger, I think even like the audio guys probably hate me for just talking without a mic. But I think you touch on a big issue of how not to individualize. And like, I think the running thread as we keep this conversation going is the systemic issues at hand, right? That these are not, you know, it's not a person who becomes a sex worker who is responsible for what happens to their health or their access to health or lack thereof. It's not injecting drug users. It happens in a system, right, where somebody is an injecting drug user, and then there's a system that prevents there's a barrier to healthcare or support in any way. And then also when we were talking about gender-based violence, about how the system fails women, continues how we fail women by putting the blame, by putting the responsibility on them. They must go report. They must make sure they get a rape kit. They must make sure the case is being followed up. They must be strong when they talk to a police officer who's victim blaming them, you know, or when they get to a clinic. And also with the NCD issues, I mean the issues around how in a society as unequal as South Africa do we promote healthy eating without looking at the systemic issues that result in obesity, that result in diabetes, you know, and also not look at it from a point of just adults, but look at children. Stunting is a very big issue in South Africa. Every time I'm driving in any part of the country for a story or for just whatever, and I drive past the school and I see short, big-bellied babies, small kids. You know, you can see, like the other time I was in Mpumalanga, I stopped and I asked this child how old he was. He was 9. He looked 5. He looked 5. And that's malnutrition, these issues. How do we talk about it without also, you know, making them look like poverty porn and still having the dignity? And I know, Mark, you said you wanted to kind of chime into the issue of non-communicable diseases as well and how they're represented in the media.
Yeah, I said some of what I wanted to say, but no, it's fine, absolutely. But I'll say it because listening to Spo got me excited. Excited is probably the wrong word, but again, it's not understood that this is a story. We, in our language, we talk about NCDs, and half of you don't know what NCDs is, which says something, because we have our own language that excludes and keeps people out of discussions, or how non-communicable diseases are becoming, in some ways, the new HIV, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to inequality. If you look at inequalities in access to cancer drugs, for example, but also about how journalism, in the way that's being done, starting to be done, has to join the dots. So, you know, it took me a while to understand. Spo talks about, you know, obesity and overweight amongst black women, the connection, and you kind of think, but how can that be in a country where most people are poor and there's no income? How do people in that case get overweight? And then to understand the connection between malnutrition and obesity, and in particular how malnutrition in children cuts paths for obesity. It seems completely counterintuitive to the ordinary person in the street, but as I understand it, it's completely medically sound. And then it leads you to questions, well, you know, how do poor people get overweight? And Spo answered that. Because there's no regulation on your McDonald's and your cheap supermarket companies, retailers that put all the shit food near the counter, so people buy all the shit food because they don't understand anything about their health anyway, because health literacy is so poor in this country. And that's linked to corruption because we pay a company called Sadmon 450 million rand for a few years to communicate public health messages, and it does, and it manages to do nothing. But then all of this is in the context of the right, of a constitutional right to sufficient food. That's in our constitution, and a duty on government to regulate food producers and retailers, both from a point of view, I would say, of price, of essential nutritious foodstuffs. The same principles that apply to medicine should apply to foodstuffs. You can't excessively price medicines when it's linked to the right to healthcare and cause people to die. You shouldn't be allowed to excessively price basic nutritious foods when it's linked to the right to sufficient food, but we don't regulate it. in any way. So then the story continues that the people buy the shit food, it causes an epidemic, various epidemics, and who pays ultimately? Ultimately, it goes back onto the externalities that make McDonald's and company rich are shifted back onto the public healthcare system, which has to deal with an increasing burden of non-communicable diseases, which are shifted onto the taxpayer, which then means that there's less money for dealing with HIV, which then means that you have your perfect storm of ill health, which is becoming unmanageable in South Africa. And I heard a few days ago talking to one of the most senior health professors in the country, Slim Abdul Karim. We have 3 times the burden of disease of an equivalent income country elsewhere in the world. We've got the perfect storm. It's one of the reasons why health is out of control. We're Bangladesh when it comes to burden of disease. And it takes us back to why what the people here do is so important. Because it's not just health is over there and economy is somewhere over there. Health is at the heart of economy, of fiscal policy, of a whole variety of issues.
No, definitely. I couldn't agree more with what everyone's saying, which leads back to health is everything and it's connected to everything that we do. And the biggest challenge is how to, like as a health reporter, how to communicate this information, the scientific information. Like for example, around obesity, right? Hungry children become obese adults. Why? For the simple fact that science says that when you are starved as a child, your body gets used to storing all the energy, the little energy it gets. Because in South Africa, many children, the only meal they get is at school. So their bodies get used to storing all that energy, and then they become adults who have little money, whether they're doing their working, their menial labor jobs or whatever it is they do. And when you go into a restaurant or when you go into a supermarket, buying 10 Rand chips and a loaf of bread and a Coke is way cheaper than trying to have brown rice, lettuce, a salad, spinach, and grilled chicken, right? So what happens is that then these adults that for 10 years, their bodies were starved, now eating high protein and high carb diets, and that results in obesity. But so now we are tasked with trying to translate all the science into in a way that the general public will understand it. This then brings together that how do scientists give us that information? Are scientists writing this? Are scientists accessible to journalists? Are they availing themselves? Are they media friendly? And it brings up, it's about fixing an ecosystem of information and communication in order to be able to inform a whole country of people who need this information before it's life esidimeni, right? And I see, Sbo, you have your hand up and you want to say something, so I'm just going to push it back to you and then.
I think Ponzo just starting to report on the issue of non-communicable disease, and especially linked to food, is seeing how as health, and there's more health scientists here, is that health scientists, you often are competing with business, with economists, right? And economists will never, what we're seeing is that as much as when we started reporting on this issue, then you get the private business, big corporations influencing the business journalists, right? And the business journalists will look at it from an economics perspective and not health. And therefore then, usually, who's more believable in this country, when it's in the business, and especially for policymakers, for if you want to effect change, who will believe you better? It's the business journalists that believe them better. So we need the evidence, right? And I think we were talking about this earlier on, that we need the evidence. If we can actually have access to more evidence to the research, that even if it's a tiny form of research, we actually need that, because we are competing out there with business journalists who are more interested in looking at economics more than health.
Just on the evidence though, and I did mention this earlier when we were talking before, and where we are, like as Ponzo pointed out before, we don't publish anything that is not backed by science, so it has to appear in a journal a peer-reviewed journal before we can put it out there. And obviously, because we have a responsibility, and often what we're dealing with is sensitive information that if you give the wrong information, you could really cause a giant mess up. But what I have found, because I read now, all of a sudden, I never did science in school; it was never a thing for me. All of a sudden, I'm reading all these scientific journals, and often what happens is I want to read an article for my story, a journal article, but then I have to pay, I don't know how many dollars for that article. I am a journalist. I might be at a donor-funded place, but I don't think they're going to be paying $38 for every journal article I want to read. I've tried to reach out to the researchers. I read somewhere that you guys are like, yeah, no, just tweet us. We'll send you the research. It doesn't happen. So that's also quite difficult for us because we want to give the right information. We're trying. I mean, I'm trying reading all these things, trying to make sense of them. But often, then the things that we really need, the tools that we need are not there. And I also know that we also battle sometimes talking to the researchers because they get quite annoyed with us for dumbing down their research. But what I would like to say is, the general public is not reading your journal articles, yeah? Because you write it like, it takes me a while, and dictionaries and asking, and what is going on here? If you want your information to get out there, you have to, also, and help us to make it decipherable. We're not trying to dumb it down. We're trying to make it, accessible to everyone, And if you take what Mark said earlier about health literacy, people don't understand all this stuff. So it's up to us and and the people doing the research to be able to tell the people who need to know. We're not dumbing it down. So maybe don't yell at us all the time.
No, definitely. I know, Vuyo, before, as we were talking, having tea outside, you shared a story and saying that, you sent your article to a researcher because you just wanted them to check the science, and it came back red.
Yeah.
And
No. So the scientist obviously asked quite nicely to proof check or proofread their quotes, and as a professional courtesy, you do that once in a while, but it's obviously not the rule or whatever. So I sent the article through, came back, red line all over, not because of I'm misrepresenting their facts, but they wanted to present it in a certain way. And I was just like, well, I mean, if that's the attitude going forward, then, I mean, at the end of the day, we can't really work together that way. We have to have mutual respect in our professions because there's a certain role that you play, and then there's a part where I take over and I deliver that message that you're trying to get out. And I just think we just have to have mutual respect on that.
And so we are journalists and activists, so we can go on forever, and I'm well aware of time, and I want to open it up to the audience. But as one last question, we've been talking about the things we've covered and the things we've done well. What are the things we've missed? And I know, Mark, you're going to lambast us, and perhaps maybe there's something that we're missing, and we're going to come out of here with stories. But what have we missed? And this is not just a question for Mark, but for all my panelists. What is the story from the past year that you wish you would have done that you didn't even get a chance to do? But we'll start with Mark and then just go around and then open it up to watch Dylan's OST and then open up to the audience.
Okay, I'll just give you a list, that's all. But it's not a reflection on you because the subject is huge. But these are stories that are not stories. I attended a workshop exactly a week ago on children's access to palliative care. 800,000 children estimated in this country don't have access to palliative care, to basic pain management. Can you imagine the implications of that? And for simple reasons often bureaucratic, mismanagement, lack of pressure to fix the systems, etc., etc. Huge consequences. Human stories there, many human stories, many adult stories of parents who try to look after children in pain. Second issue also to do with children, and I think children's health generally is not, doesn't get what it needs. We keep on talking about medico-legal, the 80 billion rand in medico-legal contingent liabilities. We don't look at the children who are harmed, who have been harmed at birth, in particular, cerebral palsy epidemic that we have in this country. You know, I've seen it in the work that we do in rural areas, in KZN, in Umkanya Kude. You know, the number of children with degrees of cerebral palsy who are in rural areas, who can't get access to schools because they can't get transport. There's a story there, and I think that's an important story because, again, it's something where if there was pressure, you know, if government just fixed perinatal obstetric care, etc., in the public healthcare system, even if it took it 10 billion rand to do it, it might save itself 80 billion rand in contingent liabilities for medico legal fees, medico legal claims, plus people a lot of pain and a lot of indignity. Two other just very brief things. We don't cover enough the way the private sector works, in inverted comma, or doesn't work. So a lot of the focus is on the crisis in public health, not the crisis in private healthcare. It's a different type of crisis, but it needs covering. So the health market inquiry last year, a few of you covered it, but nobody gave it the weight. You know, it produced a 500-page, if you want evidence, there's a 500-page report by the Competition Commission that they've put on ice because the Competition Commission ran out of money. But it's one of the most important reports in health ever generated in this country. And the last thing I'd say, because I've mentioned AIDS, just to flag, Dylan mentioned, I think did mention it, climate change and health, and the overlap between climate change and health. And there's already evidence of the impact that climate change is having on health, on malnutrition, on the whole bunch of things. And that's something I think we need to start raising flags about through journalism.
And you, Vuyo, what do you think are some of the issues that your heart saw about that you might have missed and you didn't get an opportunity to cover?
So one which is particularly very personal to me is mental health. In 2017, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. So then began my journey with the illness, a journey that is shared with many others out there. And I think what was great in terms of, not great, but I mean, Life Estimini shone a light in terms of mental health. But shone a light on the mental health disorders that everyone sort of had already associated mental health with, so people being institutionalized. And depression and anxiety, I think, was one of the biggest stories last year in terms of just by the sheer number of people that we saw taking their own lives. By the sheer number of people, from students to academics to famous people, you know? And for me, it also just spoke to the oneness of it all, how we are all in this struggle together, because health affects not just the people that we report about, it affects us as well, you know? So I remember in 2016 actually writing on mental health, one aspect of it that I also still have to go back on that I feel like I missed, and I still, you know, wish I get to this year, was a very scary one where a mother whose 32-year-old son was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was very violent towards her. But you know, the structures in place just weren't there to help her. So what she'd be advised, every time she called the police and he was violent, she'd be advised to open a case against him because they can't refer him to a hospital. I mean, they can't refer him to like a psychiatric hospital. So she'd have to open a case. Her son would have to go sit in jail for having a mental illness. You know, so it's those stories that I think still have a chance to get out there that we still need to focus on, because the way we treat our mental health patients, it just leaves a lot to, there's so many more stories out there, yeah.
And just to your point, right, like, so we've talked about the institutionalization, right, of like severely mentally ill people. But like, I always wonder, like, with the privilege that I have, every time I feel like I need some mental health space, I can like book myself into a few sessions with a psychologist. But what happens to the domestic worker who is going through stress and anxiety? Can she walk into Barra or Charlotte Maxeke and say, you know, can I be diagnosed, like, this is what I'm going through, I just have, generalized anxiety and depression, and how is there therapy is there access to therapy, just normal therapy every day, just like go talk to someone, a psychologist in these public health institutions. So Life Esidimeni rightfully and shouldn't have, because it shouldn't, Life Esidimeni shouldn't have happened to begin with, but rightfully shed light into the lack of mental health support in our public health sector. And yeah, I totally.
I was just looking at the WHO stats on our mental health profile as a country, and if you have stats that are saying, there's 0.8 psychiatrists per 100,000 children, child psychiatrists. Where are our children going to go? How you're going to struggle as a parent getting anyone to diagnose your child, let alone diagnose you as an adult. And it's like it was like 1.52 psychiatrists available for adults. So it's just a dire situation all around, and yeah.
And you, Dylan, what is the one thing you're looking for?
Okay, so mine, you're gonna recognize it. And it gets reported on, but for me, it's how it's reported on, and it's child sexual abuse and pedophilia. It's my thing. We always have hysterical conversations about pedophilia, and it's almost like a bad word. You can't say it. I was even kind of scared to say it up here. It doesn't fit with what we're talking about. Except for it does, because when you experience sexual abuse as a child or trauma as a child, it changes your brain. And you're talking about all these mental health things, where I'm not saying all mental health problems as an adult comes from child sexual abuse, but, trauma as a child leads to mental health issues as an adult. Trauma as a child, if you're a boy, and I'm not throwing men under the bus, but men are 10 times more likely to become violent and sexually violent as adults if they were abused as children. And like I was saying earlier, we have these hysterical conversations about it. It's not something that happens here. It is something that happens over there, always. And that fascinates me because if you look at just the history, it is something that happens everywhere. It crosses racial lines, class lines, all of the lines, from Catholic priests to school teachers to the uncle. And I think that we focus, I watched Leaving Neverland recently because it came out with the Michael Jackson, So now this is like, it's all big now, right? Michael Jackson was a pedophile. But it worries me that we only are interested in it when it's famous, or when it's, like what was it, the Parktown Boys, when it's a teacher and it's sort of this big thing, when it's actually happening in our families every single day and people don't want to talk about it. And I hear over and over and over how adults do know that it's happening and they just look away. And these are serious consequences for us as a future. Our country, we're broken. As a society, we're broken people. And this is something, like we have a GBV crisis, gender-based violence crisis, worldwide. But we don't want to talk about this, or we want to have, like I keep saying, this hysterical conversation that doesn't get us anywhere. So I would like to see us covering it in a different way. In a humane way. I would like, and I'm going to get so much flack for this, but I would like to see us helping people who identify as pedophiles before they abuse, and reporting on it in a way that, we can try to help them not get to a place where they are alone with a child.
So I think for me, Mark hit it there with the private sector. And I think there's so much, we see, especially in South Africa and the rest of Africa, state failure is a huge issue. And I think nobody's looking at what happens when the state is weak, and the role of private sector. And I think whether it be, right now, Healthy is looking at the mining sector and the environmental health and the link to the mining and water and sanitation. And again, going back to the food issue, looking at the food industry, and I think, for me, I think linking it back into always, I think health gets so disintegrated, and I think Bhekisisa did such a good job with the Bosasa story, where it linked Bosasa to a health story, and I think that's what we need to do more, where we look at politically what's happening and how do we link it back into health. And I think what happens when states fails us, right? And then also like looking at the health budgets. But I think for me is going back to, I think the common theme has been around children, and I've been thinking about children quite a lot. And again, where are the children in the NHI? If we analyze the NHI, there is not even one section that focuses on children. And I think you focus on children's like mental health issues. I mean, we've said it so much, but there's a big health policy that is coming, which is the NHI, and doesn't mention children anyway. And I think for me, that is one of the biggest stories that can tie in all these issues. And so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much to all my panelists. We could go on and on about health, and because we do this for a living, and yeah, we just always kind of like hijack everyone and try to tell them about these issues that we're individually and collectively passionate about. But just to wrap up and to open it up to the audience, we're just gonna watch Dylan's very moving OST documentary about one drug user how the harm reduction program literally changed this person's life. I was still at Bexisa when Dylan started shooting this, and it did take a year, which is another thing we were talking about health journalism takes time. It's not a quick, sexy, take tweets from the internet and put it in a news website. It takes time, and it's delicate. And Marco, I remember Dylan showed me pictures of Marco when they started, and I couldn't even recognize the picture at the end. I didn't think it was the same person. Sorry for spoilers, but let's just watch that, and then we'll be open for any questions and any feedback about the things we've discussed. So
Cool. Just quickly, I want to make a remark on the film. I've lived with somebody that was getting off heroin for 6 months. We're trying to help him get methadone and everything. And I think I had moral questions in the beginning as to how does that help with the addiction, because he's getting on another sort of opioid. And it helps a lot and is super necessary. So thank you for sharing that. And secondly, just on the topic of access to good food in townships and everything, I've recently gone back to the Limpopo where my mother stays, and I've been away for 16 years. And I used to live in this place called the Wahome. We used to be a Banchistan. And when I was a kid there, we used to have gardens, have a local economy with stores and everything. But recently we have malls coming in, KFCs and Nando's, and the entire local economy has died out, and people are not eating well. Security is an issue. So thank you for highlighting that as well. But my biggest question right now in terms of femicide and sex education, what can we as a public do? Because government is not doing enough to regulate what sex education looks like in school. What can we do as a public do to try and educate people about sex education?
Hi, my question is just, who do you see as health journalists, as knowledge producers? Do you see only scientists or academics as knowledge producers, or also the public?
Hi, I'm Leanne. I'm a health policy and systems researcher. I also work.
I'm just from a request from the panel to just project for the audience to just project a little bit more.
Cool, thanks. Leanne, I'm a health policy and systems researcher, and I also work in the public service. I think health journalism plays a really, really important role in a number of different ways in which we tell stories from the health system, and I think all the work that you do is great. I actually want to respond to the question about what was left out. And I think there were many important points raised about how HIV is not a story anymore, or the rising epidemic of NCDs. And I think the stories that are left out actually are broader health system stories that speak to how we build health systems that address all the priorities that you've raised. And what we do is often tell stories of health systems in crisis, as opposed to telling some of those other stories. And so I guess just to pick up on some points on how we shift some of those narratives and not only paint a picture of a health system in crisis. I know that there are a lot of challenges in a health system, so certainly not to distort that at all, but equally there are other stories that need to be told about what's happening out there.
Hi, I'm Megan. I just wanted to thank Dylan for the film at the end. I have my grandmother actually died in rehab during apartheid because she was forced to go cold turkey off of alcohol, and she suffered greatly because of that. So I really appreciate you kind of going into the dangers of going cold turkey and that. And I also wanted to ask all of the journalists if autistic adults and autistic kids ever come into the radar for you in terms of stories, because it's a massive issue, and I'm speaking as a mother of an autistic child, the partner of an autistic man, and someone whose almost entire family is diagnosed as autistic. There's a massive, massive problem with autistic kids being sexually abused, emotionally abused, physically abused, by everyone from parents to occupational therapists. Autistic adults are, there are so few systems in place to look after autistic individuals, and it's a spectrum of different needs. And people are just falling through the cracks in the system, and a lot of people are turning to, are self-medicating as a result. So I'd just like to know if that ever comes up on the radar. And personally, I just think that as someone who also studied journalism, I think it's a massive, massive story. And the Western Cape has been highlighted by autism activists as being one of the most dangerous hotspots for abuse of autistic children. Children are being fed bleach by their parents because they are being told that it takes away the autism symptoms. So I would just like to know a bit more about that.
Finding research, peer-reviewed research about the prevalence of autism in South Africa is impossible. We don't know. I asked so many experts, so many scientists, what is the prevalence rate of autism in South Africa? I asked the Department of Education to send me a list of all the registered autistic children in every province. And it took about 6 months for responses to come. And this is not because, like, with maybe weekly, bi-weekly calls because it's not prioritized. Like, for instance, I'm sure many of the people at WITS know about the Johannesburg Autism School, right? Which used to be at Charlotte Maxeke, and now it's separate. And it's like a champion school where they run the most comprehensive public autism school I would say, in the country, and I profiled them in this. But I think there is like a lack of research about South Africa's autism prevalence and what autism looks like. And secondly, there's also gendered perspective from what experts say, right? A lot of the markers to diagnose autism are done through what autism looks like in boys and not in girls. So we have, like, for instance, when I went to the Johannesburg Autism School, I think out of 300 and something learners, less than 10 were girls, right? And where are the girls? Where are the girls? They're missing, because the way autism presents in girls or in female-bodied people and in male-bodied people is not the same. And so there's a whole there's a whole gender that's going undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. So I totally agree with you. It's an important issue that goes underreported, and from a health journalist perspective, it's because if I don't have the science, and we know the kind of also the controversies around autism with in the early 2000s, that study that came out that linked it to the vaccines, and how that's become an anti-vaxxer kind of like trump card, that vaccines cause autism, right? And so I'm very, like, the reason it took me a year to come up to write only 2 articles is because I did not want to stigmatize autistic people, but I also did not want to use research that is not trustworthy. And so it's about also going into communities and finding out. A lot of in a lot of black communities, people don't know what autism is. And so you find an autistic child is called a special needs child. And in one of the stories, I highlight this by interviewing a woman who moved from Lesotho to Johannesburg because she wanted her child to go to the Johannesburg Autism School. And for 10 years, she was blamed for wearing pants when she was pregnant, that's the reason her child was autistic. She didn't know it was autism then. And also, just, is the public health system equipped enough to diagnose as many children? So there are a lot of issues that go beyond the representation, but I think the issues that I've mentioned are kind of like the barriers that come in place. And with that, to the journalists in the room, we were also asked about, like, who do we see as knowledge producers? And what determines the people we interview? I'm assuming that's where the question is going, like, who are the people we give voice to? I don't know. Who wants the conch?
Okay, I didn't realize, why am I volunteering? I think the first thing in health journalism is that it's not just the scientist, it's not just the expert, but the human, right? We have to tell the story from a human perspective. So it's actually going down. Actually, it's so hilarious. It's so funny because there's no story in health journalism without the one who's affected by it. So the knowledge producer, people who experience the public healthcare system, is the people who need the sex education. It's the mother who can't. So I mean, so for me, I think it's a combination. So it's a combination of the activists, right? Because the activists will give you another voice, but also the most important people are the people who are affected by the issue. So never to ignore that voice. And I think Ponzo highlighted it earlier on around the issue of voice. And I think those, as a health reporter, that's the most important voice in your story.
I mean, I'm just gonna really back up what you say. That's what I mean, and I think you can see it in the Marco video, now that you've just watched it. What I got from that, from a lot of people, was basically what I got back from you guys, that they were shocked, and they also were like, but isn't it just swapping one drug out for another? And I think that if I had had only the experts saying all the important things, and Yanni, the guy, he's great. I mean, he also speaks in a really accessible way. I was very lucky with him. But if it was just him telling you all of that information, I don't think it would have been as meaningful. I think what was meaningful and what changed people's minds was seeing Marco from start to, to finish, So exactly what you're saying, like, give people, you have to, and it's like journalism 101, I guess, make it relatable, bring somebody, like, statistics and whatever are, like, they're important, but when you can put a face to it, that's when you really touch people.
Okay, so the other thing about health journalism is that it's very, very broad. You get you cover from your abortion to pop health to HIV to a range of things. So there's no one voice really. There's no one. What did you call it? Knowledge producer. But we also, just to big up actually activists, your Section 27s and your tags are very good actually at making cases for their stories. I mean, Ngaba is there. Yes, there's Ngaba. He always gives me a call trying to advocate for their stories. And it's not that we just lift from them, but also you do the work as well as a journalist, so you do connect the dots. So yeah, that's one of many ways that we get the knowledge.
I just
You can go first. All right.
Sorry, I forgot. I forgot you in the corner there. Sorry, Mark. I just wanted to add, in terms of also when we talk about the knowledge producers and having access to case studies, and also not trying to find the same case study all the time, or creating perfect case studies, right? And I see this particularly because I focus a lot on gender-based violence reporting and trying to find the perfect rape story. And we sometimes do it unconsciously as journalists, a story that will be believable and or what we think would be believable. Because obviously our biases and our own, we also grow up in this society, right? We're not immune to it. And so in doing that, in also finding knowledge producers, I think, or the people that we think have the knowledge, is also going back to thinking of issues as human issues and not health issues, and helping scientific knowledge producers translate that and working with them. So I know a lot of scientists are very, when they do human case studies or research with humans, they're very possessive over opening up that information to journalists or to the general public. But it changes so much, right? We're not saying give us the names and addresses of everyone. Give us the names and addresses of everyone that you've interviewed. But if you could ask your case studies, if there's a media request, hi, there's a journalist from this, I trust them or I don't, or what? I trust them, and I think they do justice to your story. Is there anyone who volunteers to be interviewed? So you're not pressurizing them, but you help us become the conduit between your knowledge that you've created that is scientific and the actual people experiencing this?
I just pick up a couple of points for my journalist colleagues here. The question Leanne raised, I think you're right. There does need to be more focus on health systems, and we do need to focus on people that make the health system work against the odds. You know, I'm aware that there are hospitals that work. You know, we've had contact for many years with Manguzi Hospital in the far corner of KZN. It works in a system that's broken. What is it that makes it work? There are departments within otherwise dysfunctional hospitals that work. There are hospitals like Ditlabeng Hospital in Bethlehem that was disaster #1 hospital that has been recreated by the people who work in that hospital and now is an excellent hospital in many respects. And I do think we should tell those. Then the question on sex education, I just want to make as a point of information something that isn't, I think, understood enough. When it comes to health, children's rights to health are different from adults' rights to health. The Constitution says children have a right to basic healthcare services in Section 28 of the Constitution. It's different from Section 27, which deals with people's rights, everyone's right of access to healthcare services, but where it then says, according to available resources, progressive realization, blah, blah. What that means in layperson's language is that children have a right to quality basic healthcare services now, that there should be a standard that has to be met by any means possible by the state. But that hasn't entered into activism up to this point, and we haven't been helped by the medical community, because I keep on saying to pediatricians and people, define what are essential basic healthcare services for children. Because once you've defined that, then we can fight for it. Then we can insist that this should be provided with immediate effect, and just as has happened with the right to basic education. And that links to the question about sex education. You know, it's a travesty, it's a disaster. If you look at the rates of teenage pregnancy, if you look at HIV still amongst young girls, if you look at sexually transmitted disease, if you look at boys and girls' lack of understanding of their own bodies, of their sexual orientation, of gender, etc., etc., it should not be what it is, and it has to be changed. And again, one, it has to be reported, and there is evidence. I know Soul City used to do, Sue Goldstein and people used to look at the state of life orientation programs and what a mess it was, unfortunately. So there is evidence, but it's also linked to this argument. You know, I said to people a few years ago, probably 10 years ago, the Constitutional Court, there's a really important Constitutional Court case, the Teddy Bear Clinic case, where it was, you know, the Constitutional Court said, yeah, for 15 and 16 and 14-year-olds have sex with each other, right? If the Constitutional Court has seen and accepted that young people have sex with each other before the legal age of consent to sexual intercourse, which is different from an 18-year-old, obviously, and a 13-year-old, but 14 and 15-year-olds or whatever, if you accept that kids have sex with each other, then they have a right of access to healthcare services like condoms in schools, like information that make it possible for them to have sex with each other safely and not get HIV. So that should be something that ought to be winnable.
Definitely, and just to add on to what Mark's saying about sex education, right? What can you, so you were asking what can you do, right? If you have a younger sister, if you have a niece who's in a public school, I think you should start knocking on the doors of those public schools and saying, in 2017, Angie Motshekga said that the sexual health policy is going to be implemented in schools. What are you teaching my niece? What are you teaching my daughter? What are you teaching my child? Or like, what are you teaching my neighbor? And also telling people about it and making people realize, like, for instance, I grew up in a very conservative house, and every time sex is mentioned, like, you know the typical everyone gets shy or everyone gets angry, trying to stop the conversation. And it's about like also trying to infiltrate it into everyday conversation and realizing that teenagers are people and they have feelings. And think about when you were 13 and with all these hormones rushing through your body and what were the thoughts that we're going through. And I think, but the most important thing is for the public to put pressure on institutions. And this will happen only if the questions get into the room. So if someone is an SGB member or you know an SGB member when you're in this room, it's about then writing an email to the board to be like, hi, what is exactly is being taught to our children in the school about sex? Do they know about condoms? And asking these questions, because there's one thing to write about the stories, but for the actual implementation on the ground, it takes champions and normal people raising the issues up.
I think I want to just answer the broader health system and when it's not in a health crisis. And I think, so it's quite interesting because from a news angle, I'm just going to be honest, is that nobody on our side, when we've often written those stories, and you find that the news outlets do not want them when there's not a crisis as yet, right? I've often wanted to write stories just on the NHI and looking at public-private partnerships, because we've seen, there's so much research in South Africa that shows how corruption, again, private sector coming in, and which, when you think of PPPs, sorry to use, but again, is which ones are the best, and usually it involves an NGO and stuff, and linking again to the community healthcare worker crisis in South Africa, right? But those stories, again, it's so hard to get them out there. The media will not use them. The media wants that story. You can shelve that story, but the day when something happens around one private company, then they want it. So I think, I'm not sure how to answer your question in terms of how do we then maybe ask you again, as the researchers, to actually maybe, because another thing is, media is changing, right? It's not only the journalist that writes, but it's also the responsibilities, I think, of the people who have the research. Mark has been writing so much, and that helps us also then bring in those agendas through the media, because if Mark, as somebody who's an activist who writes about that, then suddenly there's an interest. So it's also thinking about, at the moment, it's the media is also changing, and who tells the story is also changing, and it's not only just journalists. So I think there has to be more collaboration between academics, between civil society, and how do we get these stories out there? So yeah.
Hi everyone. My name is Amanda, and I've been wanting to ask this question since yesterday. But I would just like to know if you've touched on the abuse of antiretroviral drugs. And since it's so easily accessible to the general public, should it still be accessible, especially for patients or individuals who abuse antiretroviral drugs and combine it with addictive drugs like Niope? So should it still be easily accessible to the general public?
Mine is more of a journalism comment, and I think it is also to everybody in the room. I know that both Section 27 and eHealth News have worked with independent community media, which is where I come from. But I think there needs to be more work out there. We've talked about voices, knowledge production, distribution, information spreading. And I think, I'm talking about the independent community media, not the Caxtons or the Media 24s, but the people who are sitting in Klofenwaba and Kala and Toyando and places like that. So you've got passionate people there who've set up their own newspapers. They are in different languages, because the one issue that hasn't been discussed here at all is language. We're also sitting as the center. We're here from Cape Town and from Joburg. And I think that, I know it's got to do with resources, okay, and money and time. But I think, for example, Ponzo, when you went to see the person in KZN about the HIV/AIDS person, a local community journalist wouldn't have drawn so much attention. and that person's anonymity, you know the word I mean, would have been more possible. I also think that the kinds of voices that you would get from the community media, like talking to the kids and to the parents about what is happening around condoms in schools. It's easier in a small community to get that information without it being a big fuss. So I think it's both about collecting the information as well as distributing the information. And I know it's a heck of a lot of hard work. And it is to do with resources. But when you're going to your donors, include this.
My name is Kay. Chairperson, thank you so much together with your panel. I love journalists because you always tell us what's happening behind the public or in the corporates. But I think you need to broaden your scope. What do I mean by that? Just next door, here in Mozambique, a catastrophe happened. And you, journalist, our local journalist, you are not there, some of you, most of you. We only see the big tabloids, like CNN, Al Jazeera, Sky what. But it's just next door here. You are talking about health now, which is very good, Mark, and your partners here. It is alleged that there might be an outbreak of cholera to what happened there in Mozambique, especially in, there's a town called Bahira there. They've set a camp, but it is alleged that there might be an outbreak of cholera, of which that can also affect us as South Africans. So I think, guys, you are confined to one place. Thanks so much to Gift of the Givers, the South African Defence Force, which have stepped in there. But you, as journalists, as the people, we inform the people, as the public, try to also extend, report beyond the borders of South Africa. Don't be just here. Yes, we appreciate you keep our government on toes, you report all this corruption, what, which is nice, yes. But please forge some links with your counterparts across the borders of South Africa. Thank you very much.
And now I want to challenge you because I think you're missing a really important opportunity, and it partly hinges on the way that much journalism rests on the idea of a story rather than a process. I think that you have a really important constituency that you don't talk to at all. It's children. I think you could access children very easily by linking strategically sets of stories to the curriculum to strengthen life orientation, which, as we know, is absolutely shocking, to get the stories that you want out, to make it processual, and to strengthen constitutionalism in a younger generation that will then carry through.
Thanks very much to, I'm Desiree. Thanks very much for raising the issue of the sensationalizing of stories about sexual violence. But I wonder about whether the narrative has shifted, as one of the speakers said. Because I found, for example, with the reporting on sexual harassment cases last year, there was still a trend to sort of eroticize stories of sexual violence. So it sort of became titillating stories of sexual intrigues. So a question for you all, I think, is how does one move away from that? You know, instead of speaking about these stories as though these were sexual intrigues, these are stories about violence. Yeah.
I've really enjoyed the conversation, around how the knowledge economy grows and who's part of it and who's not. Just a couple of very brief comments. As a researcher, and I've heard a lot, and I take these points, that we need to develop a common language around science and medical research. But, some things that we need to recognize that we're not dealing with. Scientists are not trained to do this. It is not part of the formal curriculum when we train researchers to teach them to communicate their research. People learn on the fly. And when they get it wrong, there are severe consequences for getting it wrong, which is why people are very hesitant. And I don't see any movement towards actually creating a formalized curriculum intervention to deal with this, one that actually is effective. There are focus programs. The second is around ethics, and again, researchers tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to ethics. I think we'll all agree there's no black or white when it comes to ethics. There's a whole gray zone. And so when there's an ethical issue, scientists tend to be more conservative than rather saying, we'll take a chance and see, we'll give you access to an individual and let's hope it turns out for the best. It doesn't really work that way. People tend to be more cautious. Thirdly, when it comes to social media and electronic engagements, again, I think there's no training. Researchers are very ill-equipped to deal with this and the fast pace at which questions come and things turn around. So I don't think you'll find a researcher who doesn't want to create relevance or meaning from their work. But I just think that the skill level is not there. And then a final point is that, indigenous languages are not growing, to a point where we can incorporate a scientific discourse. And it's debatable whether you anglicize words and put them in these languages, whether we're actually achieving the goal. So, those are just statements. There are no easy answers, but they might be worth considering.
Hi. First of all, thank you to the panel. That was actually a very interesting conversation. My name is Buto from Section 27. I was hoping not to speak, but there are a few things I need to, comment on and a few questions I want to say after that. So, first of all, I think it's unfair to say that journalists are not going to Mozambique. There are lots of people who are going there. I think at the moment there are about 10 friends of mine who are journalists who are actually there right now under very severe circumstances. People from Sunday Times were there, people from Mail and Guardian were there. Some people were going on their own costs as opposed to companies because of the conditions in which they work. So I think we need to just be very fair to journalists sometimes when we say comments such as those. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I want to speak about is around the stories that have been spoken about, or have been written about, but maybe not as much as they ought to have. The one thing is that we're going into an election year, and although people have spoken a lot about issues around migrants and health through the circular, I don't see that happening often enough. Migrants get denied their rights all the time, and this is something that we need to actually ensure that people know on a sustained basis. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is there's a lot of work that's done around the budgeting process, around budget time, but it doesn't happen often enough for people to know what the process is, what it takes for people to actually go and speak at portfolio committees and stuff like that. Just this past budget, we, for the first time, had pensioners going to Parliament and speaking in front of the select and standing committees to say they actually need more funds. They came up with their own submission and they did that, which was very inspiring. But who else knows about the process that to actually going and standing in front of a select committee and speaking about that? So yeah, that's what I want to say.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the contribution so far. My name is Thabo Lesol. I want to...
Thabo, please just speak up. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to say, for me, in terms of this panel title, which is around the big stories of health in this past year. In my own reflection, I think some of the messages we've had around oncology in KZN have been really good success stories. And I wanted to just maybe project that as being a good story of the year in terms of health in South Africa. With all the challenges, so we must also foreground that. And then I just wanted to make a comment about health journalism and perhaps maybe what is an advocacy point to take forward is how do we increase the section that deals with health journalism in print media? It's actually, there's a bit of a lack in this. You look across the spectrum of available print media sections. There could be more done around health journalism in print media in the same way that you have a section for arts journalism, so maybe that's just a comment suggestion. Those are my 2 points for now. Thank you.
I think we want to ask a similar question. Is it? Probably. We were a little bit sad, we're both TB researchers, and we were a little bit sad to hear that TB wasn't on the agenda because it still is the biggest killer of everyone in South Africa. And then just to add on to Bhavesh's comments about researchers, because we're also biomedical researchers, there's a lot of effort from a lot of the big funders to make public communication better that I think journalists could tap into. So a lot of big research groups and funders have communications managers in place that is meant to translate the work that we do into a publicly accessible thing. So I think journalists could probably tap into that, and people could work together a lot better to get this research out there.
Sorry, just to add on that, I think the reason why a lot of scientists or like basic science researchers are very afraid of working with journalists is because of the twisting of the work, basically. So there's so many things that happen around journalism where not the actual stuff that's happening is being properly relayed into the public. So it's like misinformation and stuff like that. So if maybe we could, like she said, like we have funders actually require us to have that public report with all our studies and whatever funding we get from them. So maybe we could try and build better relationships between journalists and researchers in order to find that best way to communicate, because we as scientists are not equipped. We can't speak basic language when it comes to translating our work to communities, and we do need journalists to properly relay the information that we find when we're doing our research.
Thank you to, there's a lot of questions. I think it's about 11. So just for the sake of time and so that we don't kind of repeat each other, I'm going to take the liberty as chair to randomly select people who are going to answer certain questions. I think I will put myself on the spot first with regards to the question regarding the ethics, like the comments regarding ethics, and also the scientists and the relationship between scientists and journalism, and the fear, the righteous fear of like being misquoted or your research being used in the wrong way. So when you to answer these questions, we kind of have to tap into health, like go back to the beginning where we started around health journalism in South Africa and the state of health journalism. Mark and I think all of us, we kind of joked in the beginning when we got here around, we all know each other. I can count on in my two hands all the dedicated health reporters in South Africa. There's maybe about 5 others who are not here today, right? So we're talking about let's say maybe 20 max in mainstream media who have to report on these issues, right? And like we said in the beginning, Spo, Dylan and I were quite lucky to work at donor-funded organizations where this is the thing that we do all the time. However, many people don't. And how do we then like remedy this? Because it's all good and well to say, oh, this is what's the problem, but how do we work to be better at this? I think one of the things that we as a health journalism fraternity need to do is incentivize up-and-coming student journalists to become health journalists, right? Like, but it also brings it back to maybe a TB Care says they will give Health E a certain amount of money to have a fellow for 3 months, for 6 months. It's about these collaborations and thinking very creatively about how do we cover health as this big topic that it is in all, like how do we make justice for it? So collaborative ways of working, incentivizing reporting on these issues, but as well it always goes back to money. Even donors, you know, right now South Africa is going through a stage where I think a lot of donors were not as poor as we were 20 years ago, so donors are feeling that there's other countries where they should be putting in this money instead of here. So there's a whole, like, it's not one thing that's the issue. And when it comes to the ethics as well, I understand a lot of times when scientists are very skeptic of me as a journalist, right? And I think that's that will become better when we form relationships outside of stories, which links to the earlier comment around reporting on issues when they are on public health systems when they are working properly and not when there's crisis. But for instance, I learned this when I was a young reporter. I always say, how would you tell Aunt Mabel to all the scientists? And Aunt Mabel could be anyone. It's how would you explain the scientific thing that you're saying to a 5-year-old, right? But it's also about if researchers want training, journalists are there at a fee. With the organizations, it goes back to, again, money. At a fee, somebody can come in and train you in how to talk in the media, how to put yourself out there. I think it's just exploring these creative ways in dealing with these issues going forward. But it is definitely, I understand why, like ethically, why you would feel not to reveal your case studies because of how sensationalism and us not respecting them in the way that you think is deemed possible. But I think with communication and understanding each other that we're on the same side, right, that further collaboration in the future will be possible. And with that said, I'm going to pass the conch to, I think, the story about story versus process, you know, and how we need to include younger children. I think Mark touched on the topic of children and how they have kind of ignored within the larger public sphere of talking about health and access to health. So I don't know if you would like to take that one. And while Mark answers, I would like Sport to think about Louise's comments on more work with community media, and also Pravesh's comments on language that merge with Louise's also around language, and how do we make these articles accessible in languages? Sorry, and I think the covering the cyclone Idai, Buto covered that very well, and another question is around how do Dylan, how do we from Desiree around how do we not sensationalize covering sexual assaults? And I say this, you remember we had a deep discussion when I was still at Big Sis around the civil sector sexual harassment issues, and how do we cover that without making it, you know, like with dignity and with the weight of severity that is needed. And Vuyo, I don't know if you want to speak to the ideas around, I'm just going through the questions now. What Thabo was saying around, and what Thabo and Buto were saying about around how do we like make sure that we cover migrants and health and not wait for a comment around like what happened earlier on this year, where what was it? It was an MOU that was sent saying that foreigners cannot access health, and also around the good news stories around health and how we make them how we make them sexy enough to be covered in our print media. I think is there a question I left? Oh, okay, the ARVs. Who would like to take that? Okay, Mark will take that. Thank you. And then, is there any other questions? I want to make sure that I've covered everyone's questions. Is there anything that I did not address? I think why we didn't talk about TB? Sorry, we just came out of TB week, so I think we are saturated and we didn't mention it. Yeah, literally, we had 10 stories about TB, and we combined them because we have a CJ program. But I don't think there's a health journalist in this room who doesn't cover TB. It's just that TB Day was last week, so we're kind of oversaturated. Sorry about that. It's the timing of the conference, not us. With that, I'm going to step away because my bladder's gonna hate me, and I'll leave it to everyone. Sorry.
Can I start and be rude and then rush off because I'm late for another meeting?
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Yes, definitely.
Excuse me. I'm very sorry. So let me just deal with two very. I think the point about link to children is absolutely critical. I wish there was more time to have a discussion about how we can do that. There's no need to be persuaded about what the value of doing that. So perhaps we can make a plan to have that discussion amongst ourselves with you. The point about community media, yeah, also, I wasn't asked to answer that, but completely. Again, it's a discussion that we should have about how do we improve our reach. And then the one question that's, I think, I can specifically give some thoughts on is this issue of misuse of ARVs that Amanda asked. Amanda, I'd partly be interested in, perhaps the journalist can answer this, is just how prevalent. We know it's a problem, and it gets reported on, or it gets mentioned quite frequently that ARVs are used in Nyope and so on and so on. I'm never sure how much of a myth it is, how much of an urban myth. I'm sure it happens. I'm just not quite sure how widely it happens, which is not to dismiss its importance. In your specific question, well, what should we do about it? Should we restrict access to ARVs? For me, the answer is no. There are 4.5 million people in the country who need ARVs on a daily basis, who receive them through the public healthcare sector. People need access to those medicines in the most convenient, least restrictive means possible, and we shouldn't do anything to make that more difficult. What we should be doing, which we're not doing, is doing much more to encourage adherence to antiretroviral medicines through public health and other health messaging. And what we should also be doing, which I think is directly linked, is we know that, where are these ARVs coming from that get mixed in and smoked and so on? Some of it may be because people are not adherent. Some of it may be because poor people living with HIV are selling on their antiretroviral medicines. Some of it may be because we know that medicine depots are vulnerable to theft, certainly have been in the past. So let's try to clamp down on the causes, on the sources of antiretroviral use for that purpose, rather than do something that becomes a new impediment for people living with HIV.
Just be wary of fake news and misinformation. Also, I'm not saying Nyope is not a thing, but the way that I found Marco is because I went to cover Bluetooth thing. Bluetooth thing is people were reporting that heroin users were shooting up, then taking their own blood out, and shooting that blood up into somebody else. This wasn't happening. This was like bad journalism. I went there. I tried to follow up on it. So be wary. Just to.
I'm just going to excuse Mark. Thank you so much, Mark. He just has to rush to something else. Thank you. Your insights are always welcomed. I'm not quite sure where we are, so can we continue to catch up?
I think it's the community media. And
Oh, yes.
And we have, I know there's a colleague here sitting here who works also in community media with the Children's Radio Foundation. So, but I think from our side, it's the community media is very complex, right? And it also has its own issues. And I think one of the things that we have to also show is coverage. And one of the things that sometimes community media struggles with is the data, right? In terms of reach. And some though, I'm not saying all, and I think, from a radio perspective, I think I would argue that there's not enough data on community radio, not in terms of reach. And then when it comes to us supplying community media, that has been one of our focus. We do have a citizen journalism project, and basically we train activists to actually report on issues on the ground. And the whole model was based on the fact that we want these issues back into community media. But I think there's always been a battle with space, also from their side, and I think we haven't figured out that model. We would greatly love to actually continue trying to find partnerships with community media, because it's been a struggle. And I think language is another thing, right? And most of our citizen journalists also have pointed at that thing out, that, some of them work in, live in rural areas, and I think writing in English is a huge thing. But I think from our side, and as a model, is that we need a sustainability model also. And one of the things that community media does not have the fund to actually pay for the stories. And that has a huge impact on how we then as a news agency supply that. And I think donors are not, so one of the things I think we need to highlight in this is that it's not easy to find a donor that can fund journalism. And I think journalism funding has shrunk. And what we're now finding is that donors are issue specific. So they'll fund HIV, they'll fund TB, but not capacitating the media. And this is where the role of MISA, the Media Institute of Southern Africa, had, right? And also it closed down because there's no funding for that kind of work. And I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. It's very complex for us. We're still trying to figure out how do we do it. I mean, at the moment, the people that are really taking our content from the ground is Health 24. And again, I think it's a big disadvantage from our side because those stories that come from the ground are actually not going back into the ground. And it's such a, it pains me, but at the same time, then you have to think of your business model and your sustainability model. And I think I would love to actually have a conversation outside this with you, and maybe let's continue with that afterwards. But just to add on Mark, I think Mark opened it up on the ARV issue, is that access, we always have to make sure that HIV positive patients have access to ARVs. And I think the story that, I think Mark touched on it, but I think the story that we're also not looking at is that how do we make sure that access, we bridge that access? And then I think again is the adherence issue. And for me, I think those are the stories that we need to be saying. And I think, again, maybe just to add on Dylan's point around like just investigating the truth in that, because we've tried to look at those stories and finding that there isn't really a direct link and there's no evidence in that.
Thank you so much, Spo, on that. Just to add on the language bit as well, like it's a struggle, and not even like to having second language speaking citizen journalists writing English stories. That's not even a problem, because that's why we have a news editor and a programs manager specifically at Health E to deal with that. When we're talking about translating scientific language into indigenous languages, 2 years ago, a friend and I from Botswana, we started a project where we were translating feminist gender terms, right, like into Setswana, our mother tongue. And the reason we were doing that is, as somebody who's a gender activist, or somebody who's really I'm self-proclaiming feminist, and who writes a lot from a gendered health lens. I was finding it every time my mother wants to pick up the Mail and Guardian to read my articles, she sometimes doesn't understand what they're saying, right? Or she doesn't understand the bigger issues. So we kind of created a feminist Setswana dictionary. And we're still in the process of trying to get it approved by linguists, because we're not linguists, right? We're not professionals in language, Setswana, even though we speak it. And it's such a big process. The same thing at Bekisisa when I was still there, when we were creating the abortion manual. So a very big part of the thing we wanted to do was create the abortion, like a little infographic in all official languages. And we enlisted, I think, Wits Language School, if I remember, and we even got like just ordinary citizens, like some of our readers, we asked them like hey, if you speak fluent Sepedi, please, and you can translate this. And the graphic was basically saying, this is the person who can perform your abortion at this stage of pregnancy. Basic, but it wasn't, we thought we'd just get it back from Wits Language School and it made sense. But there was another process of vetting and making sure that the translations are accurate and also understandable.
And somebody's come back recently, like in the last 2 weeks, to say that one of them is wrong. So
it's
yeah.
Yeah, and for me, like I was actually saying this yesterday in the office. I was like, I'm so interested in speaking to Lungile. She's a health journalist at Isolezwe. And Lungile used to be a Health e-citizen journalist. That's where she became a health journalist. And now she's writing health stories in isiZulu, because Isolezwe is a isiZulu newspaper. And I'm quite interested in sitting down with her, right, and finding how she did the transition firstly, and what is the process behind writing about health in an indigenous language, and what will it take. But we need to wrap up, so I'm just going to give Dylan and Vuyo a chance to just ask questions so everyone can go for lunch.
So I'm doing the gender-based violence rape one. So I think it's a complicated space for journalists at the moment because, like, personally, I've been reporting on rape since I was when I was still a student, so it's like 2007, you know. And it's quite disheartening because it doesn't get better. The numbers keep getting worse and worse and worse. But what we're also faced with is the audience is fatigued, and people don't care about rape stories anymore. And I mean, I think that's natural. You know, if you're confronted with rape stories every single day, you know, it doesn't become such a big deal anymore. So now the story of this person was raped is not a story anymore. So what happens is, I think I try not to do this, but as journalists, we then are pushed into, okay, well, what is the most extreme rape that happened? And we'll report on that one, because maybe that will get a reaction. You know, it's not okay, but you can kind of see where, you know, both people are coming from. And it's awful. I mean, another thing that also plays into how rape is covered is whether you're a black person or a white person. You know, Anine Boerson's rape, if you go back a few years back, rape and murder, journalists reported from inside the court there was no ban on tweeting or anything like there was for Riva Steenkamp, for instance. And Anine Boerson, like, her intestines were 2 meters outside of her vagina. That was a tweet from a journalist. You know, so it's the truth. And do I think that we should shy away from saying that because it did happen? No, it did happen. But I do see what you're saying about how it's become more sensationalist. And again, like, I don't know that I have an answer because I don't know how to stop the audience from being fatigued with the rape numbers. You know, gender-based violence is a problem. It keeps becoming more and more of a problem. We report on it. People care less. It's a really vicious cycle, and I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I feel like I haven't really answered your question.
Just to add on a little bit what Dylan said, I think it's Nahama Brody who's busy with her PhD now looking at media's representation of femicide and reporting on femicide. And I remember her tweeting about how there's a cycle of how the femicide is reported in South Africa, right? So Karabo Mokoena happened. I'm telling you, every journalist wanted to cover femicide. And we saw like a proliferation in the media of next week, you know, when another woman went missing or was killed by her boyfriend, we were hearing about it. And then it dies down until another beautiful, palatable, or what society deems as a palatable woman, a woman who does not deserve to be raped, comes into the media space again and becomes a big case. And so it's issues about what we as society value. You know, look at now what's happened with the Timothy Omotoshok trial, where Cheryl Zondi now has to re-testify, right? And the solidarity that Cheryl got in her first testifying, and what that says to us about the many, many other rape cases that don't get covered. And I think it's a broader issue around our own politics as journalists, as people, as readers. You know, why does I'm not saying Karabo Mokoena is not deserving to become a media headline, but why does that happen and not another just ordinary woman? And these are the questions that with anthropologists, with gender activists, with gender researchers, we need to come together and think about solutions to it, and how do we keep our audience not tired of this issue and keep on reporting consistently on it. And to
sorry, just on your palatable thing, we saw it more recently, I think last year. There was that young girl in Cape Town. She was maybe 19 or 20. She went missing. There was a lot of reporting about her being missing. Then they found her body. She was quite pretty. And then it came out that she was a sex worker. And all of a sudden...
it's in Durban. It was in Durban.
Oh, was it in Durban?
Yes,
sorry.
I forgot her name now. And
then all of a sudden we don't care anymore. She's a sex worker. Oh, well, she was obviously asking to be raped, right?
Yeah. And You Magazine
So-
had gotten interviews with her mother, with her grandmother. I remember this very clearly. And when it came out, yeah, you're right. So it's
So-
not just about us as the media.
Yeah, and also that like, we're tasked with finding a case study that people will care about, which is so sick, you know? Like, is she pretty? Is she famous? Is she white? You know, because if she's not, we don't care.
Is
That's
she
all.
straight?
Oh yeah, if she's straight, yeah. Leave my people out.
Just on, yeah, just
Sorry,
let me
you
just
went
jump on
down,
there.
yeah.
Just on the migrants in health. Definitely, I think we need to focus on that as well, because I think there's a lot of scapegoating going on with our government, who are basically, you know, putting the blame on migrants for overburdening the health system. Which is very weird. I mean, the health system in itself is, yeah, a mess. So I think there's a lot of scapegoating going on there. So definitely a subject that we need to get into.
And with that, we could spend the whole day here, but we all need to eat. Thank you so much to each of my panelists for their perspectives that they brought here. It's so different, even though we've known each other and work in the same industry. And thank you for everyone in the audience for kind of being so, like, I've been writing down story ideas for, I guess, the rest of the year. And like, and it's been such a reflective process. And also, like, I came here, like, obviously I expected to learn, but I learned so much more and exceeded my expectations. And thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch.